So welcome everybody to the Bridge webinar series. This is a webinar series that is co-hosted by the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center through MIDAS Mission 2.0, as Jay said, as well as the Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives initiative here at McGill University, and the McGill Center for Convergence of Health and Economics, led by Professor Laura today, who was unable to join us at the beginning of this. And then finally, the Global Obesity Prevention Center at Johns Hopkins University. And so our mission with this webinar series is to provide talks about different types of computing and analysis and data and science to get a sort of a bridge between a number of different topics and disciplines in order for us to have a greater picture of how we want to move forward in understanding how to model and understand public health and economics. And today I'm very happy to introduce Matt Guttentag, who is a program director with LINK. LINK is not an acronym, if I remember correctly, Matt. He specializes in undertaking systems analysis for complex international development projects, working with partners across the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. Most recently, he is focused on using social network analysis to help clients understand and improve global and local networks in the health and water sectors. He was previously a partnership advisor with the U.S. Global Development Lab at USAID, where he developed and managed the Partnering to Accelerate Entrepreneurship PACE initiative to bring together over 30 partners and catalyze over $100 million towards improving social enterprise ecosystems in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Matt has also served as a strategy consultant for leading corporations, foundations, and government agencies to increase social impact by better understanding stakeholder interest and improving systems for performance monitoring, learning, and adaptive management. Matt has an MA from the George Washington University and a BA from Duke University, and has worked on projects in over a dozen countries and is a fluent Spanish speaker. And I'll add a personal note. I personally invited Matt to come and join us here for this because I've had the pleasure of working with Matt as part of a USAID project called Spaces, where we were working in the developing countries to help USAID bring system science to evaluation, and gained an incredible appreciation for the work that he and his colleagues at LINK do in order to inform systems approaches for international development. I thought it would be a really great addition to our webinar series to have that component where we're looking at how these types of analysis that all of us are doing can be used to help real-world policy development. So Matt, we're really excited to have you, and I turn the floor over to you.
Great, thanks Sean, and thanks Tom for setting this up. Really excited to be able to speak to this group. I know the folks on this call have deep experience with all sorts of big data tools and are all undoubtedly committed to social impact. So I'm really excited to be able to share some of the tools that we've used in the past, and as Sean mentioned, in collaboration with his groups. So today I'm going to be talking about social network analysis, which is an analytical technique. Some of you might be familiar with it. But really, the focus will be on the application of network analysis to international development programming. So I come very much from a practitioner's perspective. I am not an academic, and came to this tool from the perspective of somebody looking for ways to improve the efficacy of international development programs. So I'm going to talk a lot more about the application of network analysis to development programs rather than the intricacies of network analysis techniques, because there are other resources out there which I think aptly handle the technical side of things, though I will give a bit of an overview of that. Let's see. Great. So in terms of the agenda, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the company I work with, LINK, what we do, why we think network analysis is an important tool for us. Then I'm going to give a bit of an overview of social network analysis. Well, like I said, I won't get too far into the technical details. It'll really be focused on the overall concept of social network analysis. And then dive pretty quickly into how 3 different ways that I think it can be really powerfully used in international development programs. And then move on to some of the challenges to using it, because it certainly is not fit for purpose for every single scenario. So talk about some ways in which it can be challenging. And then a little bit about how it can be really powerfully combined with other methods, which really speaks to some of the work we've done with Sean, where you can combine network analysis with some other tools to really get a robust understanding of complex systems. And so I think that'll be about 30 to 40 minutes. So I want to make sure there's some time for question and answers at the end. Though, if you do have a question as we go, please do just pop it into the chat box. I think I'll see it. I can certainly see the chat box. So happy to answer stuff along the way as well. Cool. So Link, the company I work with, we're a small business based in the US, and we're essentially a development consulting firm. So we work with everyone from large donors like USAID all the way down to very small local NGOs, but focus entirely on the developing world, and really focused on ways to help local organizations take more of the lead in development. So we actually got our start really working directly to build the capacity of local organizations. All of us at Link have deep experience working overseas and have seen sort of how the aid system doesn't always cater to the specific capabilities and needs of local organizations. So we started by helping them directly, the local organizations, fit into the aid system a little bit more directly. But as part of that, we quickly realized that all these local organizations are part of these complex ecosystems of civil society, enterprises, market systems, et cetera. And so by bringing tools that capture systems dynamics, we've found that we can really powerfully support not only individual organizations, but whole systems of local organizations, and help donors and international NGOs understand the local context better and design their programs in such a way to help these local organizations actually lead a little bit more. So coming at it very much from a perspective of how do we use these tools to help local organizations and to make development projects more effective. And we're really committed to learning and sharing. We think that in the development sector, that's a really critical part of making things better. So always looking for opportunities like this to share some of the work we've done, some of the work others have done even. I think I shared some pre-reads. A number of those are other organizations that we think do great work with network analysis as well. So we're really committed to building the sector. And if you know of organizations who are interested in hearing about this, please put us in touch, because we always like to share these things, or other groups, academic groups, practitioner groups, whatever. Sean gave a great introduction. So I will skip over this, except the last point that I'm personally passionate about providing actionable evidence. So really thinking through how do we make academic and rigorous insights, but make them in a way that they actually can make a difference to how programs are run. So trying to really bridge that divide between academic rigor and on-the-ground program design and implementation. Excellent. So I am going to get into a little bit of social network analysis. I'm assuming that folks on the call don't have a background in network analysis. If you do, this will be a little bit redundant. But assuming that folks have kind of seen some systems tools before, probably been exposed a little bit to these types of analyses. So at its core, social network analysis is differentiated from other ways of analyzing social systems in that it focuses really heavily on the relationships between actors. And the term relationship here is used very broadly. This can be anything from actual relationships in terms of two people interacting with one another, but this analytical technique can also be used to refer to commercial transactions, even co-participation in some sort of group, and anything that involves some sort of pairwise relationship that can be defined. Though in the development sector, it really tends to be a little more focused on actual interactions. It very much is a systems approach because it does it's one way to take into account complexity and the reality of the situation and the complex dynamics of how things actually are on the ground rather than how they might be in, for example, an org chart. And then the key two aspects of it analytically are nodes, which are actors, and they're represented by dots usually in visualizations, and then edges, which are the lines between those dots, which represent pairwise relationships between any two actors in the system you're studying. And then both these nodes and edges can be assigned attributes. So for perhaps with a node, if the node represents an organization, an attribute might be the type of organization. Maybe it's a business, maybe it's an NGO, maybe it's a governmental office, or it could be the sector, whatever might make sense in that context. And then the attributes for the edges could be something categorical, like a type of relationship. Maybe it's sharing information is one attribute versus transacting commercially. But then it could also be something like strength. So is it a strong relationship? Is it a weak relationship? And there's all sorts of ways to define those, which I'll talk a little bit more about. One really nice aspect is that SNA allows you to conduct analysis and quantify in different ways both the whole network. So you can look at the structure of the network. Is it very diffuse? Is it very centralized? Are there communities within the network? Is there a core group and a peripheral group? And then there are also techniques for quantifying individual actors. So which actor, which organization or person or whatever your node is most influential in different ways. And what's really nice is that you have these different techniques for quantifying that because, you know, influence and importance is a multifaceted concept. And so being the most important bridge between other groups is one way to think of influence and importance. Or just having the most relationships might be another way to think of it. So you can actually pull out these different metrics at the actor level as well. And there's a quote from a textbook down there by Stephen Borgatti, which if you're interested in social network analysis, I highly recommend just buying this book and reading it. Very approachable. He's at, I believe, University of Kentucky and has developed some of the, not only core papers in social network analysis and core concepts, but also some of the software. So a really important person in the field who wrote this book. So that's sort of the broad overview. So I'm going to focus a lot on the process of social network analysis because that's really important for how it gets applied to development programs. And I'm speaking here very much the process that you might undertake if you're working with an NGO or on a program, as opposed to purely an academic process, where some of these pieces might be kind of defined in advance. So anytime you're doing a network analysis, or anytime we've done a network analysis or are aware of others doing it with a development program, there are a couple key decision points which are worth pointing out. So one is having a really clear and well thought out definition of what the boundary is of the network. So who's in the network and who's out of it. Because how you define the boundary is going to have major implications on every piece of your analysis. And that can be really tricky in development programs because it might not be 100% clear up front who should be in the considered part of this network. And I'm going to talk a little more about the different ways you can think about that. Then, of course, you have to identify, once you've defined the boundary conceptually, you have to actually identify who is in the network. So individually, which actors are part of the network, and find them, and have a clear rationale for deciding who's in and who's out. Then, of course, you need to have data on relationships among those actors, pairwise relationships between all of those actors in the network or some subset of those actors, depending on how you're approaching the analysis. And of course, you need to be creating a typology of these different attributes, because if you're doing the analysis that takes into account these different attributes, they need to be very clearly thought out and well defined. Are you interested in organizations' functions or their sectors, for example, and laying that out ahead of time before you collect the data. And then finally, how are you going to approach your analysis and visualization? I will say, I think compared to some of the more academic applications of network analysis, the analysis and visualization, a lot of times in my experience in more practical settings and working with development programs is actually the simpler part, and these other decisions and the data collection is actually the more difficult part, because a lot of times you don't have data sets predefined, or they're very difficult to extract, whereas especially in linear learning network analysis, you might be working with data sets that are already well structured. So that last piece, oftentimes the needs of development practitioners are pretty high level. They need a decent understanding of the network, but they might not need some of the most sophisticated analytical techniques. A lot of times the difficult part is just getting the data, and then you can do the analysis is pretty straightforward often, though not always. And the key point here is that in practical applications of network analysis, it's just important to keep in mind that these decisions should always be stemming from how the analysis is going to be used by decision makers, right? What are they using this for? And I'm going to talk about a couple of those uses, but every decision, in my experience, should stem from that. So just to dive into a couple of these decision points, because I think they're really critical in understanding how a network analysis might contribute to a development program and how it might be applied. So in terms of this defining what is the boundary of the network, so a couple examples here, working backwards from the goal. So let's say you're working with an organization that has members of, for example, all of the water-focused NGOs in a given country. And it's literally a membership organization that wants to better understand how their members interact with one another so they can target their programming. So in that case, it's pretty easy. You have this roster of members, so you can just use that. So sometimes your boundary is somewhat artificially defined by an existing group of some sort. In other cases, that might not be the situation. So you may, for example, be working with an NGO that wants to identify who the key stakeholders are in a sector. Maybe they're interested in forming one of these groups. Or maybe they just want to make sure if they're developed as they design an intervention that they're targeting the most important actors in the sector. So in that case, you might have some sort of threshold where you start by interviewing a pre-identified group that everybody knows. You know, you talk to somebody who knows the sector, they give you a list, you talk to them, they refer you to other organizations, you talk to those organizations, they refer you to others, and as you go, you have a threshold that if an organization is mentioned at least 2 times or 3 times by another organization as a key stakeholder, then that's your threshold. So that's who's in the network, and because you want the network to consist of the key stakeholders. Or another completely different example, like, so for example, is working on the supply chain. So I worked with Sean on the global health supply chain, and in that case, you might have data on commercial transactions in the supply chain, so something as simple as defining a time period, and any organization or that participated in a transaction during that time period would be part of the network. So those are a couple of ways you might want to define the boundary based on what you're trying to do with the analysis. Then moving to data collection, I think this is really important because, as I mentioned, this can often be the most difficult part. So you might have data on relationships that already exist. So I would say this is maybe a little bit more common in academic studies. It's not super common in my experience in the international development settings. But in some cases, you might have a database of commercial transactions. I have worked with that. You might be working with one of these predefined networks, and they may have some data on interactions among members that they've been tracking over time, which you could harvest. Or you might be applying a more academic sort of framework to an international development program for something like voting behavior of local politicians, where you might have public data there. Though in the developing world, often even stuff like that can be difficult to pull it together. And in a lot of cases, the other way, of course, is collecting new data. So often this is going to be through surveys or interviews. And the key here is you're, of course, going to need some sort of tool for that. So there are some tools that are fit for this purpose exactly. There was one developed, I think, by, I want to say UCLA, possibly working with RAND Corporation, called EgoWeb, which is a survey platform specifically designed for social network analysis, which we've been using. There's a screenshot from a recent survey we did, and it basically lets you come up with a roster of organizations and then have every organization within that roster respond about all of their relationships with each other organization in the network in a pretty efficient way. because you are asking about these pairwise relationships. So often you're going to be deploying these surveys, essentially, to collect data. And those can be done either obviously online or in person. And then you're going to move to data analysis. Just to flag a couple of tools out there, lots of tools that can be used. Each has some pluses and minuses, a little bit of Googling, and you'll find lots of discussion forums where people are listing them and talking about the pros and cons. A couple are listed here. UCINet is a key tool for really in-depth metrics, less so on the visualization front. And these other tools here are all pretty good at visualization. I would say Gephi is probably the most widespread because it's totally open source and free. If you're into R, there are some libraries which are specifically designed for social network analysis. So yeah, feel free to play around with some of these websites and download some of these tools or look up others. And all of these tools basically break down metrics and can, in some cases, create visualization. So what are these metrics? So you have things including centrality measures, which quantify, as I mentioned, the influence of specific actors. So which actor is the most efficient path between any others, which actor is close to other important actors, those sorts of things. So there's a number of different metrics for that. The overall structural metrics, how dense is the network, do relationships tend to be reciprocated, does the network have a core group versus a peripheral group, how many different subgroups are there in the network. There are also community detection algorithms. So these are to identify closely connected clusters of actors in the network. So that's a really key technique and really useful for many settings. If you want to say, hey, within this large network of organizations or people we're working with in the village, are there clusters that we need to make sure we get at least one connection into each cluster for our program. Hypothesis testing techniques as well. So that's looking at statistical significance in terms of correlations between any of the relationship types or attributes. So if you're looking at do NGOs are they more likely to have relationships with other NGOs or with government offices perhaps, you could use these techniques to test if there's statistical significance to those patterns. And then there are some techniques for doing probabilistic modeling. So if a new member to this network was added, what's the likelihood using probability distributions that they would have connections to other types of actors in different ways. So lots of techniques. The difficulty in my experience is not in finding analyses to do with these data sets, but rather figuring out which ones are actually going to be most useful, because you have dozens of metrics within each of these, and if you're dealing with multiple attributes and relationship types, you can quickly get to hundreds or thousands of potential data points that you could, or metrics that you could provide back to an organization. I mentioned a few of these metrics, so I won't go through here. I won't go into these in detail. I already kind of mentioned these. So that's a quick overview of network analysis as a whole. Let's see. I just want to check and make sure I didn't miss any questions or anything. Nope, doesn't look like it. Okay, cool. So in terms of applications to international development, I'm going to talk about 3 uses which I think are particularly powerful. So the first, being used to design programs on the front end. So I want to figure out how to design a specific development intervention, and I might use some network analysis data as part of that. Another use is monitoring and evaluation, tracking whether things changed over time. And then finally, a really exciting use, which I think really goes along, especially with Link's core ethos, is network facilitation. So actually using network analysis alongside, using network analysis with the stakeholders you're collecting the data from, so the members of the network themselves, as a way to help them. Because I think in its best application, social network analysis, the whole approach, the whole process would be closely linked to input from the members of the network you're studying or you're analyzing, because at the end of the day, they're presumably the ones you're trying to help. And so we've really moved towards incorporating these facilitation goals into the network analysis rather than just focusing on the deliverables, the outputs in terms of research. Let's see. Cool, so program design. So why is network analysis helpful for program design? Well, international development programs do not operate in a vacuum. If you've been involved at all, you know there might be a bit of a tendency among, because of the way the current national development system is structured, to create these really clean program designs that sort of assume that, you know, an intervention is coming into a community that's not necessarily a blank slate, but not always taking into account the deep complexity and the web of power structures and existing relationships that are always there at any level, whether you're talking about individuals in a village in rural Malawi or international NGOs who are part of a global vaccine effort and are working together. In all of the, no matter what network you're talking about, there are relationships that already exist, there are power structures, there are dynamics. You might have a chart that tells you what the dynamics are supposed to look like, but often the actual dynamics on the ground look very different. And so by understanding what those dynamics look like, in some cases at least, you can use that information to have a significant effect on a program's likelihood of actually succeeding, because it can be designed to take those into account, those dynamics into account. So a couple examples here, just to put some ideas behind this concept. So you might have a bunch of NGOs working together in a given sector, and so you want to identify relationship gaps between them, because your intervention, the goal is to coordinate better in the sector. So you want to figure out where are the actual gaps, where should we be targeting our energy. So you might also, in that situation, use it to target specific groups. So you might use network analysis to understand that within this village, there are pretty different dynamics and capabilities depending on whether somebody is a part of a given subgroup, whether that's an ethnic subgroup or depending on their gender or a group of households or families. So you might target support to those groups who need it most. It can also be used to ensure a really broad inclusion and diversity of different stakeholders. So you might want to make sure that you're including some organization. If you're putting together a working group of some sort, you want to include a diversity of organizations. So you might have very basic attributes of every organization, so you could build your network based on that, or your membership group based on that. But there could be other kind of more hidden clusters in the larger network, and maybe you want at least one organization represented from each cluster. And then understanding power dynamics. So who's really influential, who's not, either at the individual or organizational level, which can be really important for, let's say, a health intervention where you want to make sure that you're targeting the most influential members of the community with some behavior change intervention, because, based on the analysis, you can see that they're the ones who are most likely to serve as examples for the rest of the community. Or maybe you want to target an intervention towards those who have less power and disrupt those power structures, depending on what your goal is. So I'm going to give you a couple specific examples here that we've been working on or have worked on in the past, which I think illustrate a couple of findings that are being either will hopefully be used or are already being used by our partners. So one example is working with an NGO who is pulling together a national group focused on water, sanitation, and hygiene in one Southeast Asian country, so in Cambodia. And one reason they're putting this together is they want to increase trust among the stakeholders in the network. So they think that there are some gaps in trust among the different groups that are involved in water, sanitation, and hygiene. Also coordination, so that they're focused on a few different things. So we're looking at a couple different types of relationships, but one of their goals is to increase trust, to create a platform where by the activities they're facilitating, the different members of the network will trust each other more and then hopefully work together better because it's a very fragmented sector there. So our analysis is looking specifically at both intergroup trust, so between, for example, local NGOs and international NGOs or local NGOs and the government, as well as intra-group trust, so organizations within each of those, to help the partner better target those gaps and really develop programming that is specific to where are the trust gaps. And so you can see here a very basic representation, you know, a bit of a stoplight sort of representation of the trust levels based on our analysis between different types of groups. So you can see, for example, LNGO, which stands for local NGOs, seem to have really high trust with international NGOs. So those relationships seem to be pretty good, which, you know, might not always be the case, but seems to be the case here. However, there's a pretty big gap when you're talking about their trust levels towards the private sector, towards development partners, which is a fancy way of saying donors. So those are your international donor institutions. And then the national government institutions. And also, somewhat surprisingly, maybe academia. So that's kind of a large number of clear trust gaps in general coming from local NGOs. So that could be an area now where our partner, and well, it is an area where our partner now is looking to design some actual activities that will specifically target how do we build trust between local organizations and these other groups. And you can see there's also in the other direction, well, not in the other direction, but rather some of those trends, some of those patterns, for example, towards the private sector is almost across the board. So the private sector's involvement in water and sanitation is not seen as, well, it's not that it's not seen as positive, but rather other organizations, including other private sector organizations, don't seem to have a high level of trust for the private sector actors involved in that network. So that's an area where, again, bringing the private sector and trying to build trust will probably be an important part of that platform they're developing. Another example here, very different sector. We looked at workforce development in 3 Nicaraguan cities. So this was working directly with a donor who's really looking very high level at program design. So a little bit less specific. In the previous case, you have an organization that already knows kind of what program they're doing, and this is about designing activities. In this case, you have a donor who says, hey, we're interested in improving the workforce development sector. We just want to get a sense of like what's going on, where are some gaps, what are the types of actors involved, who's important, where could we have some activities to strengthen the network in a way that's going to be really powerful. So we looked at all of the organizations involved in promoting workforce development in 3 cities. And one of the findings we pulled out was that NGOs are a pretty numerous group in the network. So you can see in this map here, you've got NGOs on the bottom left in yellow. Just a quick glance shows you that they are the most numerous group in terms of the number that work on workforce development. But we used a couple of our influence metrics, combined them to kind of create a threshold where there seemed to be a sort of jump in influence level. And when you filter it according to who's actually influential in terms of having lots of relationships, being central in the network, there's only one NGO. So the NGOs tend to be numerous, but not very particularly influential. So that means they don't have that many connections. If they do have connections with 2 other groups, those 2 other groups probably already have connections with each other on their own. So they're not sort of as critical to the network. So that could be an area where if the donor targets the NGOs to create better, stronger, and more linkages to the rest of the network, could possibly take advantage of the fact that there are all these NGOs working on workforce development a little bit more effectively. One final example here. This is another one that's a little bit very early stage in program design. So this was actually more of just a study done as part of a very basic, what could a donor do? Again, what could a donor do in a given sector? So this is looking at impact investing. which is a sector I've worked in quite a bit. So we looked at, we scraped, this actually did involve existing data. So this is an example where we used existing data rather than going and doing a survey. So we found a database of about 4,000 investments into social enterprises. So these were self-identified impact investments. And then rather than looking at the investor-investee relationships, we wanted to look at, are there clusters of investors who tend to invest together? Now, we don't know that if you're investing in the same company, you necessarily have a strong relationship, but in our experience working with these impact investors, a lot of times, if they have an investment in the same company with another investor, they tend to have some sort of working relationship because it's a pretty tight-knit sector. The investing tends to be very hands-on, and companies tend to not have a ton of investors. So we thought it would be interesting to look at, well, who's investing with each other in order to help target investment interventions by a donor. And what we found was you had a couple of clusters here, and when we looked at who those clusters were, or who those clusters are, by looking at the nature of those organizations, we realized that one of the clusters, the biggest one, are members of this group that is very international development focused called the Aspen Network for Development Entrepreneurs. So a very high percentage of them were members of that group. So they are really engaged in international development. They are very focused on social impact. That's sort of their core raison d'etre. Whereas you had another group a little bit further away, or far away from that group in terms of the number of connections, who tended to be based in California or New York, tended to be more what was called finance first, so focused on making a profit, but doing it in such a way that they're also generating an impact. And they tended to have a lot of investments together, but not many with that development group. So what was interesting was to look at, well, which organizations bridge those two groups? Because there's some investors who seem to be finding ways to make investments that are both going along with some of these Silicon Valley folks, but also with these kind of more social impact-y international development folks. And we thought that would be, and you can kind of see that group blown out on the right, but we thought that would be an interesting group that you could specifically try to engage if you're an international development organization, because they could be a bridge to this other group of investors out there who don't seem to be as engaged with this core international development sector as much. So that gives you, I think, an idea of some of the ways that insights from network analysis can be used to help donors or NGOs design programs. Those were all at the organizational level. I will say we've done a little bit less focused at the household or individual level, though there are also examples there, especially in the health space, where you're looking at communities, how members of the community interact with one another, and using that to design an intervention in a way that you're targeting the most efficient set of households in the community for something like behavior change. Another really interesting area that I think is network analysis is particularly powerful for is monitoring and evaluation. So that essentially refers to tracking change over the course of a program, and then also at the end of a program evaluating whether or not the program was effective in achieving the change desired. Or whether that program caused changes that were not desired, so unintended consequences as well in the best cases. So in this case, you're using network analysis to measure changes in the structure of relationships, of course. That's what you're measuring with network analysis. So a lot of international development programs are focused on shifting the structure of relationships in some way, whether that's increasing trust levels in a community, whether that's changing the behavior of a community, whether that's making connections between different organizations so they can collaborate more effectively. Lots and lots of programs do involve some goal focused on relationship change. So network analysis can be a useful tool for measuring that change. So you might be looking at whether a program has increased social capital for members of a specific disadvantaged group, where you would survey members of that group before the program and then after the program to see if their relationships reveal a change in their level of social capital. Obviously, you'd have to define social capital, a lot of literature on that, but basically looking at the strength of their relationships in some way. You might want to look at the extent to which a program improved data sharing among government offices. So a lot of focus on improving how local governments use data, exchange data, coordinate with one another using data so you can actually track that. On the more of the commercial side, the market side, value chain programs are an area where I think there's a lot of potential. So you might look at a supply chain. You might look at a program that's looking to increase the diversity of customers for certain firms or suppliers for certain firms. Network analysis is a nice and simple way to capture that information. Or, as I mentioned, you might be looking at something like investment. And so you might want to look at which investors are connected to investees in this market. And so you could track that. A couple of examples here that we're actually working on right now. So one is one of these value chain activities. So it's in Bangladesh. We're looking at the structure of relationships for what they're calling lead firms in the value chain that have already been identified that this program is working with to try to improve their operations, diversify their buyers, a number of goals around just generally improving their position in the supply chain with a specific focus on diversification. So we've just completed a baseline analysis where we looked at each of these firms, and in this case we were looking at each firm's network of partners, so traders, buyers, input suppliers, producers, any relationships they have with the government, financial institutions where they get their capital. So in this case, we were looking at each of their networks. So this is an example where we were not looking at the overall structure of any given network, because these firms were not themselves connected to each other. We were doing what's called an ego net analysis, where you look specifically at and separately at each actor's network. So of course, in any network, you could look at a given actor's individual network as part of that. In this case, that's the entirety of what we were doing, because we did not have the ability to look at the entire supply chain here. I will note that one thing I worked on with Sean's group was a whole global health supply chain. So you can apply this to an entire supply chain. There's definitely trade-offs there, because then you have to have data on all the transactions in the supply chain, of course. And then at the end of this, yeah, we're going to look at what changed in terms of the networks of each of these lead firms. Another project we're working on with a NGO partner in Ethiopia. They're creating these district-level, what they're calling learning alliances. These are essentially coordination groups looking at improved data sharing, improved active coordination among different water stakeholders. Again, similar to the Cambodia example, very fragmented in terms of you have a lot of NGOs in each of these districts who are building wells. You got government offices charged with maintenance. They're not always linked up, so things tend to break. They don't get fixed. You might have two wells built right beside each other and no well within miles of there. So huge need for improved coordination, improved data sharing. So we've just completed a baseline analysis looking at these relationships. And then we're going to, once again, track it over time, every year in this case, actually. So an example of what we're looking at here, in these two different districts, looked at the three different types of organizations within the sector. So regional government offices, which are the higher level, district government offices, which are more local, and then NGOs. And we looked at, are they sharing information within those groups? Are NGOs sharing information with each other? Or are they sharing information between these groups? And very different structure within two of the districts. As you can see, in District 1, you have much more information sharing in group ties, which is just another way of saying, with NGOs specifically, which is another way of saying NGOs do tend to share information with each other. So for any given NGO, about 1/5 of their relationships were with other NGOs here in terms of sharing information. Whereas in the other network, the other district, only 1%. So that's basically saying in District 1, NGOs do tend to share information with one another. In District 2, NGOs essentially almost never share information with one another. And then with regional and district offices, you can see it's a little bit different. In District 1, they tend to not share information as much with each other, so they're sharing more between the groups. District 2, it's the flip. You're going to have district government offices are generally sharing information among one another, so about a third of their relationships are with other district government offices. So kind of the opposite there. Anyways, that was a bit of a convoluted way to show this example, but it's essentially a way to look at, is this changing over time? At the end of the day, are we going to see in District 2 more information sharing between NGOs? Because that's clearly an area where there's not much happening. And so that's an area where we might observe change over time. And then finally, as I mentioned, the third use, what we call network facilitation. This directly engages stakeholders in the analysis. So when I say stakeholder, I mean the actors who are giving me data, who are providing me data in some way for the analysis, to actually facilitate discussion on improving relationships. And we think this is really critical. And I will say that even though I'm separating this out, I think that a participatory process is really important no matter what you're using network analysis for. As a means to both validate the results, so gut check anything you found, as well as to make sure the results are meaningful to the people who you're trying to help. So in the example I just gave, I actually just came back a couple of weeks ago from Ethiopia where I presented some of these results, and in that second district, talked to those NGOs about, hey, is this an accurate representation of how you share information? Is it true that there's not really any information sharing? Because it seemed pretty extreme. And they said, yeah, we don't really have any mechanism right now to share information with one another in an easy way, so we just don't do it. So it validated the results, and it also started a discussion around, well, how can this new platform that's being set up actually help solve that problem? So it was really important for that discussion. And so that kind of bleeds into this idea of network facilitation. So using the results of the analysis to actually guide discussions on how the network should look and what an intervention could do to make the network more effective. So one thing we do here is it gives those members of the network a really data-driven and visualized starting point for strategy development themselves. So it's not just this NGO looking at the results and saying, oh, hey, well, I guess we need to develop an information sharing system, but rather the members themselves seeing the exact structure of their current relationships and saying, oh, well, it looks like we all share information with one organization, right? But we're not sharing with each other. So there's one organization right now that's the hub, and the rest of us are kind of spokes. Well, maybe that's not the best structure. Maybe we need to have a couple of clusters that are sharing information among each other, and then we're all coming together once or twice a year to share the high-level information between these clusters, right? So actually talking about, can we structure a network that's more effective? And visualizing where the gaps are. So saying, you know, well, all the NGOs are over here, and all the government offices are over here, but they're not talking to each other. That's a gap. Or you got one group of households in the village that seem to be sharing information with each other, or have high trust among one another. You got another group over here that has high trust among one another. We need to fill that gap. And tell us how an intervention could fill that gap. So using a participatory process for program design. And then also talking about the importance of different types of relationships. So you might be measuring some way you might have a way of measuring trust. But maybe when you're actually talking through the analysis, that helps some of the members, some of the stakeholders better understand what could lead to improved trust, or maybe it could flip back and by showing the analysis, could really point out some of the ways that the analysis didn't capture trust, and that there are other ways that trust is manifested, which is great. It's a great finding. It kind of sucks if you're trying to write a paper, because that means you might need to go back and do your survey again or something. But it's really helpful from a stakeholder engagement perspective, because it helped lead to more of a broad and general understanding of what leads to trust, and hopefully what a program could do to increase trust. So yeah, I think I already mentioned this example in Ethiopia. So to show exactly how we used this recently, so we were looking specifically at information sharing relationships in this town among stakeholders, pretty small network, about 16 organizations. And we actually showed this network map, and we said, hey, one thing we found is that there's a pretty clear core group of stakeholders here that has this really complex and dense spider web of information sharing relationships. And then about half the network has no relationships with one another, and then only a couple relationships with the core group. So you got essentially a core group and a peripheral group. And what's nice is that some of the social network analysis software can actually quantify this using an algorithm. That is not what we brought to the group, because you can actually show it visually, which is more intuitive. So we can, back it up from an academic perspective that, yes, this is not just something we're seeing, but rather using this algorithm, we can see that this group really does have a very clearly distinct and stronger set of relationships with one another, and they're the core. But you can also show it visually, which is really intuitive. Hey, look, there's a spider web in the middle, organizations on the outside. Let's talk about how this alliance could improve the structure of these relationships. And I wrote a quick blog about this a couple weeks ago, which you can see here if you're interested in hearing a little more. So that's the three different ways that I think are really powerful for using network analysis, and a couple examples. I want to briefly touch on the challenges, because there are some important challenges here. Network analysis, just like any other tool, is not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve any problems in and of itself. It's not going to change the development industry just by understanding relationships. There are things to keep in mind here. First of all, data collection can be quite difficult and expensive. You need to understand all these pairwise relationships. That can be a lot. That can be, if you got a big network, you gotta get data on every relationship among every network member. Or if you're using a sample and doing the ego nets, then you have to identify those in a smart way and still collect comprehensive data on each of those organizations. In a lot of the settings we work in, that's hard. You got to get out there. You got to get in front of people in rural areas. You need the technology somehow. You need to convert that into the data structure you need. It can just be time consuming and take up both. It can be expensive for the organization doing it, and then you're, of course, using the time of the participants in the survey. Or the data exists somewhere. That's the best case scenario. You got to extract it, but that's a little bit less common. You do need the data structure in a specific way. And what I mean by that isn't just literally kind of the structure in like a data file, but rather you need data on pairwise relationships. So you might have an NGO that's already done a survey and already asked all this stuff about the relationships of the organizations or the people they're dealing with, but they didn't ask about it in a way that they're identifying each of the organizations or people or the actors on each side of each relationship. So they might have just asked, how many relationships do you have? So you have all this data on relationships. You've already kind of used all your social capital in terms of surveying participants, but you don't have data you can use for network analysis because all you know is the number of relationships of any given actor, but you don't know who they're with. So you can't really do network analysis there. So it can be a bit of a problem because you need the surveys designed in a really specific way. If you are using surveys, these can be prone to bias and errors. Obviously, every survey has a problem. But if you're asked, like for example, in the Ethiopia example, we asked, hey, in the last 6 months, did you share information in one of these different ways? People might not remember. They might want to look. They want to please the researcher or the NGO that's organizing the intervention. So they might say they had relationships that they didn't. I think because of that, I think S&A surveys can be a little more prone to bias even than some other types of surveys. Obviously, there's lots of methodologies around survey data collection that can help mitigate that in terms of how you ask questions, how you triangulate data. But at the end of the day, you can still have bias and recall error. Interpretation can be difficult, and I don't mean interpretation in terms of generating metrics, but rather the interpretation in terms of like, what the hell do those metrics mean? So you can easily figure out how dense a network is, whether it's very centralized or whether it's very diffuse. But what does that mean? Like there's no ideal network. There's not like more dense networks are better. But a hub and spoke type network might be good in some situations. A network that has a very diffuse set of relationships might be more better in another setting. So it doesn't tell you whether or not the results or the network structure is good or bad. You need to get at that through other methods, which we'll talk about in a minute. Network analysis is essentially looking at the structure of the network, but it does not tell you, and you can look at the change in that structure over time. You cannot connect that to an intervention without other techniques. It's not an experimental design in and of itself. It's not a causal technique in and of itself. You can do hypothesis testing on statistical significance of variables, but you cannot, that still doesn't tell you what's causing what. The metrics can be confusing on the practitioner side. So you might say, hey, this actor has a betweenness centrality of 0.76. Well, what does that mean? You really have to work hard to try to interpret some of these metrics for practitioners, because the numbers themselves are often somewhat arbitrary. They're often normalized, or they use algorithms that are difficult to explain. So you need to work really hard to interpret those results for whoever's going to be using them. And then finally, the visual aspect can be really nice, but it can also lead to ridiculous, very hard to understand visualization. So this is a famous map from, this is a long time ago. I think this was mid-2000s that went around out of the Pentagon that was supposed to be explaining the dynamics of different organizations in Afghanistan. And it's just this bowl of spaghetti that no reasonable person can look at and really interpret anything from. So you have to work really hard on how to make network maps useful and intuitive, whether that's pulling out subsets or using various techniques to highlight parts of the map, but just visualizing the data can actually do more harm than good, because it can overwhelm people. So how do you mitigate these? There's some technical ways for some of them, like with data collection. But for the most part, the best rule of thumb is not putting the cart before the horse and starting with the problem you're trying to solve rather than starting with the method you're using. And maybe network analysis isn't the best method, or maybe you need to design your survey and design your analysis in such a way that these challenges are mitigated. So if you're worried about the network metrics being too complicated, you need to make sure you're asking about things in a way that you're going to be able to interpret in an intuitive fashion and display in an intuitive fashion, and you're not overwhelming your audience. Another thing to keep in mind that mitigates some of these challenges and that can be really powerful is combining network analysis with other methods. And I think it's often most powerful when combined with other methods. Because, as I mentioned, SNA can tell us what the structure of a network is in a really, really deep way, but not why that structure, it can't tell you anything on its own about why that structure exists, like what led to that structure existing. How should the structure be changed? So what should the network look like? It's not a normative technique in that sense. And then it's also, as I mentioned, not a technique that establishes causal linkages. It doesn't tell you whether change in the structure can be attributed to a given intervention in and of itself, unless you design it to do that specifically. So what are some combinations of network analysis with other methods that can be really robust? First of all, qualitative, semi-structured interviews, any sort of qualitative method. I'm a big fan of qualitative methods. I think a little bit of qualitative input can go a really long way towards explaining massive amounts of quantitative insights. Because a lot of times, especially in international development, you're dealing with questions about communities where the members of those communities know what's going on. And if you just ask them, they'll tell you. And it can be really helpful to quantify it and visualize it, but you also want to just ask people about it. So if you observe a trend in a network, ask why it exists. We just did this in Ethiopia when I was out there. There were some around the core periphery findings. There were some interesting points around specific organizations that were in the periphery. So we asked people, why are they in the periphery? And they told us, well, for some of the cases, well, here's why. This organization has a hard time talking to people and sharing information. All right, well, that's really, really helpful for actually designing the program effectively, because we don't just say this organization's on the outside of the network, but rather here's why, and here's what the barrier is to including them. Different techniques to map factors. So a lot of these systems tools combine actor analysis, which is what network analysis is, with factor analysis. So looking at what are the drivers of the system. And that can be really helpful. They complement each other really well, because you might observe low trust levels in network analysis, and then using different techniques like causal loop diagramming, you look at, well, what are the factors that could be driving low trust? Is that something around incentives? Could there be incentives that operate against collaboration and towards competition, which then result in low trust? So those sorts of factor mapping can be really helpful. And on the flip side, network analysis can help explain some of the factor drivers. So they complement each other really well. If you're looking to establish a causal link, you're going to need generally some sort of experimental design. So you might need to set up a treatment group and a control group, or find some sort of quasi-experimental control group, but combining that with the network analysis to see whether change in the network structure or change in influence levels of given actors can actually be attributed to an intervention. Another qualitative technique, which we've used on other projects, we've never used it in combination with network analysis, but I think it would be kind of good, and I've read papers where people have done it. I think it's really powerful. It's a computational comparative method that looks at the combinations of factors that drive an outcome. And so you might have a bunch of different networks, each with a different set of attributes, and you look at which combination of attributes tends to lead to networks that display or achieve a certain outcome, so something like that. Or you could apply it to different actors in a network where you're looking at the attributes of each actor, and then comparing which actor's set of attributes seem to lead to high influence levels. So again, it's looking at kind of the drivers of network structure. And then different predictive modeling techniques. So I mentioned you can do exponential random graph modeling, which is a probabilistic modeling technique within network analysis, but it's pretty limited to, what would happen if you added an actor to the network in terms of their ties. But I know some of the techniques that, for example, Sean has worked on with supply chains get much more complex and can model on a much broader range of outcomes. And so, for example, in a supply chain, understanding the structure of the supply chain, how that structure has changed, but also what might happen if you ran specific change the supply chain in different specific ways, can really complement each other well. So network analysis, powerful tool in and of itself, much more powerful when combined with other methods, at least a little bit of qualitative, especially I think it's almost always a mistake not to include that, because you could miss some pretty obvious and big drivers there. But there are other techniques you can combine it with as well. I think I'm about at 45 minutes. And just have my contact information here in case anyone's interested in learning more or has some thoughts or ideas. But at this point, I will open it up to any questions on anything I've covered or about network analysis in general.
Great. Thanks. Can you guys hear me? Okay, I switched microphones.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thanks a lot, Matt. That was a really, really nice presentation. I'll open the floor for questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, either post it in the chat room or please unmute yourself and ask the question. So are there any questions from the floor? No, unless people haven't figured out how to unmute themselves. Well, I'll take advantage of that to ask the first question, Matt. It was a very nice talk. Thank you. It's really interesting to see these kind of methods, which in the lab and in academia are used very in a vacuum, so to speak, be used out there in the real world. What's in your mind? Can you provide an anecdote or an example of how you've had to explain these results to somebody that completely knows nothing about network analysis, and how you overcame that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the biggest challenges, and one of the most interesting things we do is have to you just have to explain this. So I know I've used the Ethiopia example, and it's sort of top of mind because I just got back from there. But I think it's a good example for this. You know, because we were out there and we were presenting these results to these very local level officials who have no experience with network analysis, certainly whatsoever, and many times though really sharp people and really deep understanding of the water sector in their communities, not necessarily a background in methods of any sort, not necessarily college educated or even high school educated, so not a quantitative background. But we wanted to present these results back in a way that made sense to them. And so I think it was really a process of working with our local counterpart at the NGO that was organizing this group, starting with a long laundry list of results and working really, really hard with that person to trim it down. And he really pushed us hard on, this is way too much. You need to keep things high level. You need to keep things visual. Don't use numbers if you can avoid it, unless you can connect that number to a very, very specific concept that's easy to understand on the ground. So number of times an organization interacts with another, fine, you can talk about that. But network density, don't even use that term. So that forced us to present the results that incorporate some of these concepts, but explaining the concept rather than trying to use the terms or the numbers. So in this case, rather than referring to core periphery or density, as I mentioned, we displayed a visual of the network and just put a circle around a group that very clearly had lots of lines between them, and we used the term spider web, because everybody knows what a spider web is, and we said, you can see, it looks like there's a spider web here. That's because all of these organizations, and those organizations, have a name associated with them on the screen, work with each other a lot. So that's why there's a spider web here. But if you see on the outside, there are these other organizations that are not in the spider web. That's because they're not sharing information very much, and they're not working much with that group. So what does that mean? And then we had a discussion about that. So really trying to use everyday concepts around relationships and visuals rather than metrics and referring to algorithms and techniques. As I said, we had determined the core periphery using an algorithm, but we didn't explain it that way. Instead, we used a visual with a big circle on it. So I think any way to focus results on, or explain results by using everyday language and visuals that have a very clear takeaway. And I think also displaying one result at a time. So we did not display any charts of metrics. We did not display any charts at all, because charts are going to have different metrics, different results, different numbers. I've found that those can be overwhelming, and instead, what is one takeaway, one result? So I think earlier on in the slide presentation, I displayed the chart of in-group and out-group ties. So I didn't display that there, but we did talk about that, but we only talked about one result. NGOs do not have connections to each other, and we just displayed just the NGO network, which really clearly showed like 5 NGOs and the fact that there were no lines between them. So again, that result could have been shown with a chart quantitatively in terms of the in-group, out-group tie percentage, but instead we just focused on what is the result telling us and what's one visual that really clearly demonstrates that result. So that's sort of the process we went through and how we try to approach it. But it's hard, and there's definitely trade-offs there, because you can't explain as much. You can't capture lots of information compactly. You need to spread things out.
Yeah, that's great. That's been my experience too, is that you do all this complex mathematics and simulations and things, and in the end it takes almost two-thirds more time, two-thirds of your time is spent trying to figure out how to relate that to the people that you're trying to inform, because it's so complex. It's just complex, and so it helps you. Personally, I find it helpful because it helps you to understand what your results mean rather than just being numbers and figures and stuff. So it's an interesting process.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. I think there needs to be, like, each result needs to be a story, essentially. Like, it needs to be telling. You need to have a little, like, short story that you're telling, because people really latch on to narratives. Yeah, absolutely. So I see there's a question here from Megan. Have you encountered any instances where qualitative responses may have been influenced as a result of network power relations? E.g., one organization group may fear retaliation for honest responses if they reach another actor. How do you account for that? Yes, that's absolutely an important thing to keep in mind and to pay attention to. So there's no sort of like catch-all solution to that. I mean, there's kind of 2 points where that could come up, and I'm not sure, Megan, you might be referring to both of them. So one is, if you're surveying organizations themselves, during the survey itself, where an organization, especially if you're looking at something like trust, might not want to be honest, because they might want to make it look like they have a good relationship with other organizations for whatever reason. And then another would be when you're presenting it back, and you have all the organizations in the room or the people in the room, and then that discussion could be influenced by dynamics. We did see that in Ethiopia, where you had both regional level and district level government offices. The regional level government offices are above the district level government offices, and so those power dynamics were at play, and it was very interesting to see that play out, because when it was just the district government offices in the room, they were much more verbose. When the regional government offices were also there, the district government offices were much quieter. And I think we've seen that in other areas as well. And there's not really, I think that the best thing there is to have a counterpart you're working with that has some understanding of the overall dynamics, is from the community, has worked with the community, and can be a guide there. So in this case, we were not leading the discussion. In fact, a local facilitator was leading the discussion, who had worked extensively in the communities and had thought a lot beforehand, and we had talked a lot beforehand about how to facilitate the conversation in such a way that you're encouraging open discussion. Sometimes that might be, and we've done this before, sometimes that might mean not putting names when you're showing network maps. You might just show the map and show the attribute, color the nodes by the attribute, but not putting names associated with them. So you're not calling anybody out for having a strong or weak relationship. Or you might have small breakout group discussions where you report back, but no comments are attributed to anybody. So, those are more facilitation techniques that apply to any setting, but I think, Megan, as you pointed out, there may be particularly salient when you're dealing with network analysis, where you're very starkly showing power dynamics and who's connected to who, and that could look bad for some people. So thanks, Megan. And I see another question here from Atefa. Thanks, Matt. I want to know if you have examples of using SNA for longitudinal analysis, informing either programmer, designer, evaluation, or how network has changed as the result of an intervention. Yeah, so the longitudinal analysis would I would say more likely to be used for the evaluation side, because by definition you're tracking change over time. So by the time you've completed the longitudinal analysis, the program is probably on its way or done. So the design part might be a little bit less useful at that point. So in terms of how the network changed as a result of the intervention, I would say, so it depends on what we're talking about here. So if you're purely using network analysis as an evaluation tool, you might see change as a result of the intervention, but the network analysis itself was not kind of part of that change. So for example, in the global health supply chain project I worked on, we looked at the structure of the supply chain at 2 points in time, separated by a couple, I think like 3 or 4 years. And clearly there had been some changes as a result of the intervention. The intervention in that case being the, the supply chain strengthening projects where you had some warehouses that ended up being more important, some being less important, so stuff like that. So yes, you can use network analysis to see change as a result of the intervention. In terms of seeing change that is like a little more integrated with the network analysis, where you're using it at the beginning, engaging the stakeholders as part of that design process, and then seeing change over time, I think we're still at the front end of that, to be perfectly honest. A couple of the examples I've given, we've just completed that first part, and we're going to be tracking change over time. So in the Cambodia example, we've looked at the baseline. We've looked at the fact that trust levels are low between a couple types of groups. The program is now just getting started that will be targeting those specific groups. And so we hope to see, well, our partner hopes to see change in that. We haven't seen it yet. So I think up to now, we've used it more purely for design, and we're seeing how programs are being designed using it, or purely for evaluation. So we've used network analysis to see change over time. We're just getting started on a couple that I think are really exciting in that they integrate, they do use it for program design, but then also not only inform the design, but track the change over time. So I hope to be able to report back on that in a year on a couple of these projects, because we haven't done that yet, kind of in an integrated way.
All right, so then we'll schedule another bridge webinar in a year for you to come.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So those are the only two questions I saw in the chat window, Sean.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions from the floor before we adjourn? Okay, well, hearing nothing, let me take this opportunity, Matt, to thank you once again for coming to talk to us. It was a very interesting talk. I really love it to see when people are using these kind of techniques in the real world and hear about their experiences and how they make that work. So it was really a pleasure to have you and to hear from all of your experiences. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Have a good one.